Hello everyone, and welcome to the 20th episode of Analyzing Evil. In this video, I'll be covering our patron pick for the month of March, Ammon Gert, the dreaded commandant of the Plaszow labor camp. A dreg of human history, the infamous Amon was reviled by those who lived through the Second World War in Europe, and by those who had heard of the deplorable crimes he committed during his tenure as the commandant of Plaszow. When Schindler's Ark by Thomas Keneally was published in 1982, it and its subsequent film adaptation, Schindler's List, spread knowledge of his crimes the world over, and terrified readers and viewers alike, educating the populace at large on one of the more sadistic perpetrators of the Holocaust. In this video, I'll be taking you through both the novel and the film, as well as providing a variety of insights into the life of Ammon through a number of sources, and, even though it may seem impossible, informing you on some cruel actions and attitudes he displayed that were left out of both the book and the film. The many sources I used when making this video will be provided on screen when possible, or down in the description, but the bulk of this video will be comprised of the information we're given from both the book and film. Before we begin, I'd like to provide to you a small disclaimer. In this video, there are going to be quite a few words spoken by myself in a number of languages, and I assure you, I have done my best to educate myself on the correct pronunciation, but it's likely to a trained ear some of these words may sound off coming from me. Helping me with my pronunciation for some of the Polish words is a channel called Occupied Krakow, a Polish channel dedicated to telling the story of Krakow during its occupation by Nazi Germany. This channel is a great resource for all the different aspects about the occupation of Krakow, and I encourage you to check them out. With that in mind, forgive me if my pronunciation is a bit off, and try to take it easy on me, you valiant keyboard warriors. Now, without further ado, let's begin. We'll start by taking a look at Ammon's life before becoming commandant of Plaszow. Much of the information I'm presenting to you here comes from a book titled Oskar Schindler, The Untold Account of His Life, Wartime Activities, and the True Story Behind the List, by David Crow. Ammon Gert, the third inheritor of his name, was born December 11, 1908, in Vienna, Austria, to a wealthy Catholic family in the publishing business. His father owned the Amon Franz Gert publishing house, and his mother Bertha spent her time working for her husband. As a result of his father's constant traveling for the business and his mother's work at the publishing house, Ammon was mostly raised by his aunt. This had an impact on the young Ammon, as he would state to his mistress Ruth that his parents neglected him, and it was for this reason he turned on the bourgeois social values they had tried to instill in him. During his youth, he took more of an interest in athletics rather than academics, contrary to his parents' wishes, who were counting on him to take on studies to prepare himself for inheriting their publishing business. Rather than publishing, Ammon took up agriculture in college for a brief time, but before long, he returned home to his parents to pursue a career in the publishing industry. Ammon's time as a student was perhaps the most crucial component of his pursuit of membership in the Nazi Party, as at that time, teachers and professors were encouraging their students to take part in Nazi-sponsored organizations, and he found among his peers a source of further education on the party's values and encouragement to sign up to become a member of the party. To a young Ammon, who had already taken interest in far-right ideas, it was natural that he should sign up to join. He stated to his mistress that his interest had developed when a fellow student of his had joined the Hitler Youth, and he had taken strongly to the values the Nazi Party espoused, particularly that, in his words, Nazism knew how to appreciate his physical strength and athletic ability and fostered friendship and youthful rebellion. In 1927, after his return home and brief stint in publishing, Ammon would go on to join the Styrian Home Protection Organization, which, according to David Crow, was the strongest and most virulently anti-Semitic wing of the Austrian Heimwehr, or Home Guard, the principal fascist competitor to the Nazi Party in Austria, which at the time had a more organized structure and consolidated political power than the Nazis had. After a failed coalition attempt between the Nazis and the Home Guard, Ammon left the party, and after a decree by one of the top leaders of the Nazi Party in Austria, which stated that one could not be a member of both parties, Ammon decided to side with the Nazis. On May 31st, 1931, Ammon became a full-fledged member of the Nazi Party, being assigned the member number 510764. This made Ammon a member of a prestigious group within the Nazi Party, an Alte Kämpfer, old fighter, or who had been a member at least a year before Hitler took power in Germany on January 30th, 1933. It was also at this time that Ammon's interest would grow in the fledgling organization that was the SS, to which he was attracted to due to its promise of comradeship, and was assigned the SS membership number 43673. From his new position, Ammon would go on to contribute in a number of ways to the party, including involvement in smuggling operations, terrorist activities, and an alleged part in the assassination of the Austrian Chancellor, In the years following this attempted coup by the Nazis, Amon would perform various functions for the SS, and by the time of the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by the Third Reich in March of 1938, Amon had already begun a slow rise in the ranks of the SS, and by 1941, he would receive an assignment that would guide him on the path to becoming the dreaded commandant of the Plaszow labor camp. But before we go any further, I'd like to touch on what we've already learned to see how it pertains to Amon's identity, as we learn in Schindler's List, as a psychopath. Now, the further we get into this video, the more I'm going to cover the fact that Amon eventually displays the characteristics of a psychopath. But up until this point, I can find no indication that Amon showed any violent tendencies or murderous behavior during his life before 1941. There are a few possible instances, like when he was operating as a terrorist and a smuggler in the years preceding the Anschluss, and of course with his involvement in the assassination of Engelbert Dollfuss. But from what we know of Amon, he grew up in a wealthy family. He was tall and handsome, and had an interest in athletics and many opportunities before him. We have no record of him being violent towards those around him, or towards animals, or any indicators that he displayed any kind of antisocial behavior, or any of the other characteristics that would indicate his eventual transformation into the sadistic psychopath we know him as today. It's entirely possible that early on in his life, he may have shown more characteristics of a psychopath than we're aware of, as at the time he was growing up, many of these traits were often written off as boys will be boys, or ignored altogether, especially considering he had absent parents. He certainly held a good amount of hate for the Jewish people, indicated by his induction into a heavily anti-Semitic wing of the Austrian Home Guard Party, as well as the other peoples that the Nazis had specifically targeted in their promotion of race-based ideals. And these sentiments undoubtedly only grew more intense as he immersed himself more and more into the ideology of his party and surrounded himself with like-minded people. But other than this, and the few things that we can speculate on regarding his possible violent tendencies, it would seem we have a case of a psychopath who was able to keep his worst tendencies in check until he was given the opportunity to release them without repercussion. These feelings kindled by a view of certain humans as nothing more than scum. This opportunity to release his inner beast presented himself in the summer of 1941, when Amon was assigned to a post in Upper Silesia, serving as an Einsatzführer, an action leader, and worked with a resettlement commando under Obersturmbannführer Franz Weilgung at the Katowice office of the Ethnic German Central Office. It was here that he showed his administrative talents, as well as his ruthlessness in helping to organize the resettlement of Jews into ghettos. Highlighted by Crow in his novel on Schindler was the important distinction that Amon worked in a part of the Greater Reich where economics took precedent over racial policy when it came to the fate of Jews. That's not to say that the Jews were safe in this area, but rather their eventual liquidation would be prolonged so they could be used as slave labor in a particularly resource-rich area of the Reich. At this time, Amon's overseer was Albrecht Schmelt, who, according to Crow, developed a highly efficient and extremely profitable Jewish slave labor system that housed Jews in a network of 200 camps scattered throughout Upper Silesia. Albrecht would influence Amon in not only his efficiency in handling his Jewish slave labor, but in corruption as well. Schmelt made vast sums of money by hiring out his laborers to factories and other businesses to line his own pockets and to fund a resettlement program for ethnic Germans to be relocated to the district, as well as providing aid to SS men killed in battle. Amon learned well from Schmelt, and here in Upper Silesia, he excelled, honing his skills in preparation for what looked to be a promising career in this terrible field. After his tenure was finished at the office in Katowice, he was transferred to Lublin in the summer of 1942, where he was to be involved in the highly secretive Operation Reinhard. Here he had another master of corruption and brutality to idolize, Odilo Globocnik, the police leader in the Lublin district, and the man in charge of Operation Reinhard. According to Crow, this is where Amon honed his skills in rounding up and transporting Jews into ghettos, working under both Globocnik and Hauptsturmführer Hermann Hoffel, who headed the main department of the program. We know nothing more of what Amon did during the time he served under these men, but suffice to say he likely excelled at the tasks he was assigned, and 6 months later, he was commanded to oversee the labor camp at Plaszow in preparation of becoming its new commandant. He also ran into trouble with Hoffel, which was part of the reason he was transferred, but if it had been a grave transgression he had committed during his time with Hoffel, he likely wouldn't have been given the high position of commandant. So we can assume that regardless of the trouble he experienced, his skills in dealing with Jews played a hand in his transfer to his new position. And now we've arrived at the place we all know Amon from so well, Plaszow, and his time as the commandant of that camp. From here on, I'll be pulling most of the information I'm providing you from Schindler's List, guiding you through his appearances in the film while intermixing it with information from the book that was left out, along with a few more unsavory acts Amon committed that weren't included in the book or the film. First, I'll read for you an excerpt from the novel describing Ammon's personality, appearance, and quirks that will give us a good reference to look back to as we travel through his many scenes in the film. And I quote, "Amon shared with Oscar not only his year of birth, his religion, his weakness for liquor, but a massive physique as well. Gert's face was open and pleasant, rather longer than Schindler's. His hands, though large and muscular, were long-fingered. He was sentimental about his children, the children of his second marriage, whom, because of his foreign service, he had not seen often in the past 3 years. As a substitute, he was sometimes attentive to the children of brother officers. He could be a sentimental lover too, but though he resembled Oscar in terms of general sexual voraciousness, his tastes were less conventional, running sometimes to his brother SS men, frequently to the beating of women. Both his former wives could have testified that once the first blaze of infatuation had died, he could become physically abusive. He considered himself a sensitive man, and thought that his family's trade proved it. His father and grandfather were Viennese printers and binders of books on military and economic history, and he liked to list himself on official papers as a literat, a man of letters. And though at this moment he would have told you that he looked forward to his taking of control of the liquidation operation, that this was the major chance of his career, and carried with it the promise of promotion, his service in special actions seemed to him to have altered the flow of his nervous energies. He had been plagued with insomnia for 2 years now, and, if he had his way, stayed up till 3 or 4 and slept late in the mornings. He had become a reckless drinker, and believed he held his liquor with an ease he had not known in his youth. Again, like Oscar, he never suffered the hangovers he deserved. He thanked his hard-working kidneys for this benefit. This is the man we first see riding in the back of a Mercedes through the Krakow ghetto. Here we see him being briefed on the structure of the ghetto, after which his only comment is why the top of the car is down, as he's freezing. Again, once they arrive at the camp, his only comment as his officer is explaining the layout of the camp is to ask where he'll be staying, and then to subsequently complain about his accommodations. In the book as well, Amon remarks how convenient it is that the camp is located close to a Jewish graveyard, stating to his fellow officer that they won't have to go too far. Amon would later use the gravestones from the cemetery to pave the path to the camp, a very macabre way to show his disrespect for Jews and to intimidate and shame them as they walk across the gravestones of their ancestors. His next action is to choose for himself a maid for his new quarters at the camp. From this introduction, we immediately get the impression of a self-absorbed man who seems blind to the suffering of others, whose only thought, as he's traveling through a hellscape filled with suffering people, is of his own comfort, and a man who is tantalized at the sight of the shaking hands of Helen Hirsch. A quiet excitement building behind his eyes, as his mind eagerly awaits the future of abuse he has in store for her. His physical description in the novel coincides with the appearance we see here, and of the actor who portrayed him, as aside from his sour looks and his snide comments, he's handsome, imposing, and initially pleasant to the women who are lined up to be inspected by him. Here I'd like to note something pointed out to me by a subscriber, who gave me this quote from Screen Rant, which is in turn a reference to a Time article about the film. And I quote, "Rafe Fiennes' performance as the monstrous Ammon Gert was so hauntingly accurate. When real-life Holocaust survivor Mila Pfefferberg was introduced to him on the set, she began shaking uncontrollably because he reminded her so much of the real Gert." With that in mind, it's interesting to note that the man we see on screen, though a dramatization, is almost akin to watching him as he was when he was alive. The terror Mila felt upon seeing Rafe is justified, as this shaky image of pleasantry that we're met with initially crumbles quite quickly as the scene progresses when he orders the death of the engineer, Deanna Reiter, who is overseeing the construction of one of the barracks, shot on the spot by his subordinate. This act is treated as mildly as one would order coffee by Amon, showing his strange sense of disgust at taking the word of a Jew as he proceeds to order his men to do as she asked anyway, highlighting the feeling of superiority and the ruthless brutality of a man who sees these people as less than human, and who actively takes joy in the fear and suffering of others. And as many of the scenes we cover in this video will show, the deaths of others as well. An important scene for Amon is his speech to his men about the state of Krakow for the last 6 centuries, as a place where the Jews were given a home in Poland by Casimir the Great, and his excitement at the prospect of erasing those 6 centuries by completing his work here in Krakow. In the book, he's described as having a paternal feeling when he looks upon his men, lined up to do their duty in a comradely way, and feels a sense of professional excitement at what he's about to accomplish in liquidating the ghetto. Unfortunately, this next scene that shows the process of culling the ghettos and resettling the Jews into Plaszow is not unique to Amon, and is an insight into what was occurring in countless cities throughout Europe. Here we get to see him reveling somewhat in the bloody work he's engaged in, and towards the end of the scene, he's hit with a bout of exhaustion, remarking how he wishes the night would be over already, a characteristic selfish complaint among the carnage around him. Reported elsewhere, but neither in the novel nor the film, was that upon greeting his new prisoners at the camp, Amon reportedly told them, "I am your god," which from the actions he takes would make sense, as he behaves like a wrathful, selfish god who sees those below him as things to be played with. Now this next scene, where Amon starts his day with murdering 2 people by shooting them from his balcony, is iconic, especially in the way it highlights the calm and casual way Amon goes about murdering innocent women in this scene. But there is a slight inaccuracy here, in that in the book, it's stated that Amon, rather than shooting directly from his balcony, would scan the camp with a pair of binoculars and rifle in hand, then proceed to go out from his house to commit the crime. So while it did take place, this was a slight variation made in the film for dramatic effect. But nonetheless, this is a monstrous action to take, as Amon seemingly does this for his own enjoyment, finding the smallest things to take to an extreme in order to justify these murders in his mind, and to set a vicious example for those he rules over. In our next scene, we're given a view of Amon in a business-like setting, wherein he is presiding over a meeting where he and his subordinates are attempting to negotiate the transfer of the factories of Schindler and others to the Plaschow camp. In the book, this meeting is much more formal, as it is held in the office of Schindler, and doesn't have a personal meeting with Oscar at all. But, even without showing Amon's acumen for negotiation in the real-world scenario, we get a peek into what Amon may have been thinking from Thomas Keneally, where he describes Amon scanning the crowd as he speaks, taking mental notes of who will be agreeing to move their factories into his camp, and who will not, based on the facial expressions and body language of those present. In both scenarios, though in different ways, Amon is shown to be friendly, and whether it's genuine or not, displays social aptitude and the ability to form bonds with those he works with. Not only do we see social aptitude, but a general desire to be social as well, as Amon frequently hosts parties at his villa and enjoys the finer things in life. This contradicts to a certain degree the notion that Amon had put forth to his mistress when explaining one of the reasons why he decided to join the Nazi party, that being his parents nurturing him to follow a life in their bourgeois lifestyle. At these parties, and throughout his life as commandant at Plaschow, living such a lifestyle seems to have been no problem for Amon, as not only is he a hedonist and perhaps a nymphomaniac, but he's a glutton and an alcoholic as well, putting on considerable weight and destroying his organs with alcohol to the degree that his doctor at one point tells him that if he doesn't cut back, he'll likely die soon as a result of his poor diet and excessive drinking, and he was only in his mid-30s at the time. Now these last 2 points I've touched on, his business acumen and his hedonism, are definitely deplorable acts, considering that his skill in business is tied directly to the persecution and mistreatment of others, and the rewarding lifestyle he lives is also a product of this. But they don't compare to the terror he instilled into people through the murders and torturous acts he committed and orders his men to commit. Though he was shown to have had an empathetic side to a certain degree, the strange emotional tenderness he had melded with abuse in regards to his relationship with Helen, and even flirted with restraint and forgiveness for a moment in time. Amon is through and through a sadistic, rage-filled psychopath, and though we've seen a bit of that already, it only gets worse from here, and the rest of our exploration of Amon will be dedicated to highlighting the truly horrendous aspects of Amon's character. Take, for example, the scene where Amon is pressuring Rabbi Levartov to make a hinge for him as quick as he can, and then reveals that the reason he was testing Levartov was to show that he in fact has been working at a slow pace the entire day, owing to the small pile of hinges he has laying in the basket next to him, highlighting his penchant for toying with people. Amon likely knew Levartov had been working slowly, and whether that was due to him being unable to work quickly, or doing so because he was lazy, Amon would have shot him either way. But instead, he chooses to play with Levartov, to in the moment give the man a sense of hope, working as fast as he can in order to please Amon, only to be given a cold dose of terror as he reveals the reason for testing him. Later in the scene, we see 2 of Amon's guns misfire, and as a result, instead of murdering Levartov, he strikes him in rage and leaves him there, throwing a tantrum as he's denied the satisfaction of murdering another person. In our next scene, Amon is interrogating a group that came from a barrack where a stolen chicken was found. When no one speaks up, he grabs a rifle from one of his men and shoots a random man, preparing to shoot another before a boy steps forward and points to the dead man, blaming him for stealing the chicken. In reality, this moment claimed 2 lives, as when Amon shoots the prisoner with his rifle through the head, the bullet passes through his head and kills the man behind him as well. In the book, it's explained that perhaps he was in a good mood that day, because when the boy pointed to accuse the first dead man, Amon laughed and accepted the boy's answer. However, I think this harkens back to something that happened when Amon was liquidating the ghetto. The moment when the poor soul trying to escape through the sewers stumbles upon Amon and makes up an excuse that he was ordered to clear the bodies from the road, giving Amon a proper salute as he speaks. Amon laughs and chooses to believe the man. In both cases, with this man and the little boy, Amon is choosing to forgive them because they amused him, not out of any goodwill or belief in the words they're speaking. It's simply a minor reward, a delay of their death, for providing him a moment of levity. Next we have Stern talking about a day when Amon went to the barracks of a man who had escaped, and had the escapee stand in his place as he murdered everyone in his immediate vicinity, and then every other man as he walked down the lines, totaling 25 innocent men in the span of what must have been 5 minutes. If Amon had been casual with killing before, this shows to an even greater degree what lengths he's willing to go to prove a point, and how easy it is for him to waste any number of lives that he pleases. Our next scene with Amon is meant to highlight the developing feelings Amon has for Helen, but in the book, this manicure is instead performed by a girl named Rebecca Tannenbaum, who spoke German and would chat with Amon as she worked on his hands. This instance has a far more sinister note to it, as when Rebecca gave Amon a manicure, he kept a revolver placed at his elbow, and one day, when Rebecca was feeling courageous, she asked Amon what he kept it there for. He replied quite coolly that it was there in case she ever nicked him. Directly after this passage, we get several instances of violence Rebecca was privy to, which I will quote directly from the book. If she ever needed proof that a chat about spas was all the same to Amon as an act of madness, she had it the day she entered the hallway and saw him dragging her friend Helen Hirsch out of the salon by the hair, Helen striving to keep her balance and her auburn hair coming out by the roots, and Amon, if he lost his grip 1 second, regaining it the next in his giant, well-tended hands. And further proof came on the evening she entered the salon, and one of those dogs, Rolf or Ralph, materialized, leaped at her, and holding her by the shoulders, opened its jaw on her breast. She looked across the room and saw Amon lolling on the sofa and smiling. "Stop shaking, you stupid girl," he told her, "or I won't be able to save you from the hound." During the time she tended the commandant's hands, he would shoot his shoeshine boy for faulty work, hang his 15-year-old orderly Poldek Dershowitz from the ring bolts in his office because a flea had been found on one of the dogs, and execute his servant Lishek for lending a droshka and horse to Bosch without first checking. Yet twice a week, the pretty orphan entered the salon and philosophically took the beast by the hand. This is as good a time as any to mention that Amon had trained the dogs Rebecca mentions to attack people on command, and would routinely use them to mutilate many of his victims. Now, our next scene with Amon is the scene with him having a two-way conversation with himself in front of Helen. This scene was an act of creative dramatization on Spielberg's part, as nowhere in the book is it mentioned that a moment like this ever occurred between Amon and Helen. But it is, however, mentioned several times in the book that Amon had an attachment to Helen, and though he abused her, he never wanted to kill her, and he was reluctant to wager her on the card game between himself and Oscar later in the film. Though it was a bit of creative liberty, I think it does well to highlight the strange relationship Amon had with Helen in a short amount of time, showing us to an even higher degree how sadistically self-centered Amon is, abusing a girl he has feelings for, while also satisfying his never-ending appetite for suffering. After this birthday party scene is concluded, we get a scene where Amon is speaking up on behalf of Oscar, after he's been detained for kissing the Jewish girl at his party. This scene is also an exaggeration, as it was Oscar himself who did the talking with Sherda, after he served 5 days in a cell. But this scene, like the scene with Helen, serves the purpose of highlighting Amon's friendship with Oscar. In the book, it said that Amon went on believing till the very end that Oscar had been nothing but a friend to him, and from the scene at Amon's dinner table earlier in the film, and the scene where Oscar is trying to convince him to become Amon the Good, we also get the notion that he, to a certain degree, was both envious of Oscar and respected him. Though Amon was similar to Oscar in many respects, it was said that Oscar had a sort of charm about him that Amon likely envied, as well as his bravado and the comradely nature that seemed to be an extension of Oscar himself. We can discern, then, that with his previous comments about his attraction to the brotherly values the Nazi Party espoused, that Amon saw in Oscar what he was actively trying to be, but Oscar was just a step ahead of him. Amon was described by Keneally as being, in Oscar's mind, his dark and berserk brother, his evil counterpart, so to speak. So it would be fair to say that the opposite were true for Amon, and he was as equally fascinated by the good of Oscar as Oscar was at the evil of Amon. Now, we don't get to see any more of Amon after the scene where he's playing a game with Oscar for Helen's life. But before we get to the end and talk about Amon's arrest, trial, and execution, I would like to highlight a few more terrible things the man was reported to have done during his tenure as commandant. I'll be directly quoting these from the sources that I state beforehand. From Schindler's Ark, regarding a prisoner who was singing banned Russian songs. Engineer Krautwert himself seemed at first stunned and had nothing to say. In an uneven voice, he reasoned with the Hauptsturmführer, who stood beside the scaffold. "I am not a communist, Herr Kommandant. I hate communism. They were just songs. Ordinary songs." The Hangman, a Jewish butcher of Krakow, pardoned for some earlier crime on condition that he undertake this work, stood Habenstock on a stool and placed the noose around his neck. He could tell Amon wanted the boy hanged first, didn't want the debate to drag on. When the butcher kicked the support out from beneath Habenstock, the rope broke, and the boy, purple and gagging, noose around his neck, crawled on his hands and knees to Gert, continuing his pleadings, ramming his head against the commandant's ankles and hugging his legs. It was the most extreme submission. It conferred on Gert again the kingship he'd been exercising these fevered months past. Amon, in an Appellplatz of gaping mouths uttering no sound but a low hiss, a susurrus like a wind in sand dunes, took his pistol from his holster, kicked the boy away, and shot him through the head. When poor Engineer Krautwert saw the horror of the boy's execution, he took a razor blade that he'd concealed in his pocket and slashed his wrists. Those prisoners at the front could tell that Krautwert had injured himself fatally in both arms. But Gert ordered the hangman to proceed in any case, and splashed with the gore from Krautwert's injuries, 2 Ukrainians lifted him to the scaffold, where, gushing from both wrists, he strangled in front of the Jews of southern Poland. From an article on Gert and the Plaszow death camp by British military historian Mark Simner. Joseph Bow, a Plaszow survivor, recalled Gert as a hideous and terrible monster who ran the camp through extremes of cruelty that are beyond the comprehension of a compassionate mind. For even the slightest infraction of the rules, he would rain blow after blow upon the face of the helpless offender. Anyone who was being whipped by him was forced to count in a loud voice, and if he made a mistake, was forced to start counting over again. During interrogations, he would set his dog on the accused, who was strung by his legs from a specially placed hook in the ceiling. In the event of an escape from the camp, he would order the entire group from which the escapee had come to form a row, would give the order to count 10, and would personally kill every 10th person. At one morning parade, in the presence of all the prisoners, he shot a Jew, because as he complained, the man was too tall. Then as the man lay dying, he urinated on him. Once he caught a boy who was sick with diarrhea, and was unable to restrain himself. Gert forced him to eat all the excrement, and then shot him. From a detailed account of the trial of Ammon Gert at the Holocaust Research Project. Very often, mass hangings would take place, in public, in the presence of Gert on the Appellplatz. In the same manner, he organized mass shootings of prisoners. These executions on many occasions were conducted in a manner that the victims were ordered to stand above the prepared ditch, after which they were ordered to jump in, several at a time. In cases of opposition, they were knocked down with rifle butts. At the moment of the jump, the SS men standing on the edge of the ditch fired their guns at the jumping people, after which others were being pushed in, without worrying about those that were in that grave, already still alive and only wounded. In the end, after all of this horror, Amon was arrested by his own organization for his gross misconduct, diagnosed with mental illnesses, and eventually arrested at an asylum in Bad Tolz by the United States, and then turned over to the new government of Poland after the war, which found him guilty of crimes against humanity and had him hanged. He was reportedly unapologetic throughout his entire trial, and, typical of many men convicted of war crimes during this time, he stated that he was just following orders. For what it's worth, it took 3 times to hang him properly, so take that as you will. But now we have come to the end of Gert. And, in the end, who was Ammon Gert? He was a child born into a wealthy family, who was taken in by the popular racial sentiments and fascist ideals of post-World War I Europe, fostering a desire for comradeship, intense ambition, and hatred towards the people he thought responsible for the decline of his country. Through a veritable license to kill, Amon, as commandant of the Plaszow labor camp, tortured, abused, maimed, and murdered a staggering amount of people, not only through the orders he gave his men, but by his own hand, reveling in the fear he instilled in others, and his crimes, committing these terrible atrocities as casually as you might brush some dust from your shoulder. Ammon Gert was a cold, ruthless, sadistic psychopath who willingly and enthusiastically participated in one of the greatest crimes in human history. Though he deserves to be forgotten, and his victims remembered, his life and the lives of others like him, who committed far worse crimes than he, must serve as a lesson to all of us on the potential for human brutality, and a terrible insight to what happens when you stoke the flames of hatred in someone, to the point where their inner demon becomes more and more realized, and is then allowed to roam free and sow evil with impunity. With everything that there is to know about Amon, he is without a doubt one of the most heinous and despicable men to ever live, and is more than deserving of being labeled evil. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Amon? Did I miss anything throughout the vast sea of information about the man? Let me know down in the comments, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured in a future episode while you're at it. Don't forget to check out the many sources I used for this video listed down in the description if you have more interest in the topic, as there is an enormous amount of good material to read on the subject. Thank you to all of my subscribers for supporting me, and if you like my videos and want to see more of them appearing in your feed, think about subscribing yourself, and give this video a like while you're at it. If you'd like to support the channel even further, you can sign up as a patron over on Patreon, which helps me immensely, while also giving you access to different perks, with more to come in the near future. Thank you to everyone who's signed up so far, and a most vile thank you to the names you're seeing on screen now. Feel free to join the channel's Discord server by following the link in the description below to interact with both myself and other fans, and follow me on the social media platforms listed there as well to get occasional updates on the channel or to get in contact with myself. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.